Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Cafecito con Colon. We are ready for another great and beautiful day here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. It is going to be an awesome Thursday, the second day of July, the second day of the second half of the year 2020. Today, I'm so happy to have Alexandria V. Taylor with us to share her thoughts, her lived experience, her journey, her work, her passion, and tell her story. You're in for a treat. Hey, Alexandria, is that the same t-shirt you were wearing in the photograph you sent?
It is. I did that on purpose.
I love it. You do make your
Thank
ancestors proud, and I am proud to know you.
Oh, well, thank you. I say it's more of an affirmation that I strive every day to make my ancestors proud. I don't think I've reached it just yet.
Believe me, your impact is bound to have made anybody and everybody proud.
Thank you.
You are very welcome. I always try and look through that lens of giving pride to the people that have supported me on my journey. So I really appreciate that t-shirt a lot. I'm always trying to make Valencia County proud. All the people who
That's right.
voted for me and gave me the opportunity to serve. Good morning, Dr. Roy Ball. Good morning, Elizabeth. Good morning, Marianne and Adrian. Good to have seen you this last week. And good morning, Pammy. Glad you're with us this morning. Buenos dias a todos. Good morning, Kathleen Holmes, another superstar in our social profit landscape, making a difference every day. Good morning, Liz Otero and John Moore. Glad to have you with us this morning. All right, we're gonna get going here. Good morning, Anthony. Good to see you this morning. Thank you for joining us. Appreciate you being on Cafecito con Colon this morning. My name is Brian Colon. I'm humbled and privileged to serve you as your state auditor on my 549th day of awesome in office, and thrilled to be hosting over 100 episodes of Cafecito con Colon now. We have taken the last 5 weeks to make sure we give a space and a place where we can all come and learn. And we come and learn by way of listening, by giving a very comfortable and safe space for Black voices to be heard, to help give us context, to give us an opportunity to live with more compassion, more understanding, more empathy, and more inclusiveness. We come from a beautiful state of New Mexico, Tierra del Encanto, the land of enchantment that has got an incredible multicultural history, story, and any chance I get to support people who can assist us in telling our story, I'm going to do it every single time. And that is no exception this morning when we have Alexandria V. Taylor with us today, who is just an incredible superstar. Our paths crossed almost for a long time. We knew about each other's work and space and place for years. And now in this last year, our paths have crossed a few times in person and virtually, and it's really been an enriching thing for me. And I'm so glad to have you with us this morning, Alexandria. Thanks for coming on Cafecito con Colon.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you for having me.
You bet. So as is always the case, I'm going to put up some links, get started over here, and then you and I'll come back together here in about 8 or 9 minutes, and we'll get started. Is that okay?
Sounds great.
All right. So look, we've got lots of new things going on. We have a new order from the governor regarding, and it's really, I would really say that there's a very small piece as it relates to travel restrictions upon return or entry into New Mexico, and the quarantine, the 14-day required quarantine is back in place. But everything else is really, as best I can tell, about enforcement. It's about adhering to the orders that were in place prior to now, especially as it relates to face masks, face coverings. And here's the good news, folks, and Alexandria, we should all be thrilled about this. Finally, as they say in Spanish, al fin, finally, the politics should be out of this, because I don't care what side of the aisle you're on, our leaders at the top are all singing off the same sheet music. Wear a mask. The president, the vice president, Leader McConnell, they're all saying it. They've all embraced science and embraced best practices and said, wear a mask. So it's no longer blue state, red state. It's no longer Democrat, Republican. Everybody's on the same page now. I think the people who aren't on that page are the ones who refuse to listen to science. Those who were on the face mask issue said it was political. And so for those of you that said it was political, what are you saying now? Just wear your face mask. Wear your face mask. So that's really what they communicated yesterday. We got to do this for each other. We can do this. We can get through this. We, 500,000 lives have been lost. Just for a second, 500,000 lives lost. This isn't the flu. 10 million people have tested positive. Let's just do it. And thanks to all the municipalities in New Mexico who have bent to best practices, not what they want to do, especially as we enter 4th of July weekend, but they have embraced best practices. There are a few outliers, whether it's the mayor of Grants or a couple of down in Eastern New Mexico. Hopefully they can just get on board and do the right thing. Do the right thing. But let me give you a couple of links. Dr. McCaffrey, good morning, Jermaine. Great to see you this morning. Thanks for all your feedback, Jermaine, and thanks for all this. Good morning, Rebecca Puck's there. Puck is always online with us, and I'm grateful for that. Puck is a tremendous leader, great public servant. She's got a great story. Someday I'm going to tell it. But there is the New Mexico Political Reports coverage of the announcements yesterday. And let's see, what else do I have for you? And he always does a good job covering with McKay covering the state affairs and business. There's his story in Albuquerque Journal. Dan Squared covered that. And again, leading with the governor's mask mandate will be enforced. $100 a pop. Why don't you just wear your mask and make a $100 contribution to the nonprofit of your choice? Why don't you take that $100 and give it to the Revamp Food Project or the Coalition of Sexual Assault Programs or the many nonprofits that we featured on Cafecito con Colon. They're all your contributions. So wear your mask, take that $100 savings because you're not going to get cited, and get to make it happen. Do that today. Lynn Troyan will be very proud of me for announcing that. Okay, so let's see here. A couple more cool things. $9 million in TIDS. That's taxable industrial revenue bonds, or not TIDS, but the IRBs. Sorry, IRBs for fresh food, fresh produce. Great coverage there on that story from Bernalillo County, looking to expand New Mexico's fresh foods. This is a Santa Fe-based company. They're going to do a big project out of the Balloon Fiesta Park. I think that is good news. Good news for New Mexico. Other good news, the tram is reopening for those of you that are interested in doing that. I think they cut it down. They put in Lexington and protective measures. I heard you. I know that 10-4, no, 10-3, not 10-4. 10-4 is the trucking term. 10-4, good buddy. No, 10-3, I think it's called. The restaurant at the top of the tram. I've been there once or twice, and it's really fantastic. So that's going to reopen. So that's pretty cool. And oh, great story. More feel good stuff. K4 covered the UNM medical students who are doing more care packages and serving our community. And that is a heartwarming story. We did that for the frontline workers of New Mexico, and just great stuff there. And then my friends at Heritage Hotels and Resorts are reopening, and want to give them a shout out. One of the most philanthropic groups of people I know in New Mexico, Jim Long, Adrian Perez, and their leadership team take a dive in New Mexico's social profit, landscape, and business community. They are incredible leaders, and we wish them the best during this time. It has been so difficult on the tourism sector. So we're glad they're getting ready to open. I don't know how this ended up in my inbox. A little embarrassed, but I'm going to share it anyway. I guess I somehow got to the HollywoodReporter.com. What does that say about me? I'm not sure. It catch my attention that Beavis and Butthead is returning with 2 new seasons. And for those of us that are 50, we might have some memories of watching Beavis and Butthead. And I don't know what that says about me that I wanted to share that today. You can make your comments, and I welcome them all. And whatever you have to say is totally true. But anyway, I'll leave it. See, Alexandria, you never know where this is going to go. You didn't use Butthead this morning, did you? And you're muted for right now, so get ready to unmute because I'm about to bring you on. Let's see here. Oh, this is cool. I've never been a big space guy, but somehow during this COVID-19 pandemic, I've all of a sudden gotten a little more interested in that stuff. The liftoff we just did, but there's a cool website here and a story about NASA's project with the Mars rover, and I thought, let's do something today. Grab the Mars rover. That's kind of fun. And in serious news, I appreciated Senators speaking before the Senate regarding the impact on our Native American communities and how we've got to continue to step up and get at the federal level for our brothers and those communities that are just so deeply impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. And then share the story here about store workers urging let's not declare humanity. This is a great little glimpse into the life of essential workers. Closes beautifully. It says, a kind word can go on with the environment. Everybody is trying to navigate. A kind word can go only in this new environment that everyone is trying to navigate. So maybe Carlos, or maybe it was Dr. Mowry, one of them just said, you know, we just want to be loved, and we just need to spread love, and a kind word goes a long way. So let's do that. Let's do that. Let's see here. I think like we got for we're not getting clear signals and messaging. This is a story on here about you're preparing for the actual school supply ahead. If they're going to be in the classroom, if it's going to be a hybrid, it's going to be a difficult time for educators and our students. So let's support them on that work. We're having really bad sound issues. You know, Alexandria, can you hear me?
I'm here, but I'm getting a lot of feedback.
I am wondering about whether or not we should.
You're muting. Okay.
All right, let's see if that repaired it. Does it sound okay for now, Alexandria?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good.
Sounds good for now.
Let's try this, and let's hopefully we can move forward. Okay, thanks, Cyrus. Thanks, Ms. Olmsted, for helping me out on that, and Kim, thank you for letting me know. Okay, good, Jermaine, thank you. All right, I think we're good now. So I fixed it. Imagine that. I could be called a techie this morning. Okay, so let's do this. As in the words of the famous living legend, Dr. Lenton Mowry. I had 2 living legends on Cafecito con Colon in the last week. Dr. Lenton Mowry and the good doctor, the good pastor, the incredible New Mexican Charles Becknell. And his legacy lives on through Junior, and his story is so powerful. And doggone it, like, that guy is so comfortable telling me whatever's on his heart and whatever's on his mind. Did you see he took me to the task on this African American history in New Mexico book that I held up? He's such a great man. Golly, I love that guy. He makes me a better human being. Absolutely. Right, Alexandria? You know him well.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
All right, so let me tell you about Alexandria, because we've got good sound now, and it is now time to bring on our guest. It's 9:15, and we're going to do it. Alexandria Taylor, and I call her Alexandria V. Taylor because that V stands for something really special, and she's going to tell us about that. But she's known as Nisi in her community, and she is the Deputy Director of the New Mexico Coalition of Sexual Assault Programs, where she oversees and supports the services provided by 13 rape crisis centers around the state of New Mexico, as well as 32 sexual assault coordinators within community mental health agencies. In her role as Deputy Director, Alexandria V. Taylor provides technical assistance. She develops training programs, creates standards of care in the sector in New Mexico, brings a level of cultural competence to that discussion that is so important, has been so forgotten over the years. But when I speak to mental health professionals, when I speak to rape crisis advocates and leaders in that line of work, it is so important to have cultural competency because the fragility that people enter that space with is so difficult and so challenged that to walk into a support system that doesn't have cultural competency and doesn't have leaders that look like those who have been victims and who we try and take from that place of being a victim to being a survivor, and then ultimately someone who thrives, that need for that diversity and cultural competency cannot be overstated. And that's where you are so important, Alexandria. And I'm so glad you're in that role. Let me just go on to say that prior to joining the New Mexico Coalition of Sexual Assault Programs, Alexandria was the executive director in my home county, Valencia County, the Valencia Shelter Services in Los Lunas, New Mexico. Go Tigers, class of '88 right here. She coordinated multidisciplinary teams that included 6 law enforcement agencies, Child Protective Services, the DA's office, the judiciary, and many community partners. She has keynoted and trained statewide and nationally on anti-oppression and institutional bias in social services. Hence what I just said about the work she's doing now. Alexandria also serves on the board of directors for the ACLU New Mexico. She was born and raised in New Mexico, and a major portion of Alexandria's existence is spent contemplating and living out, radically mothering her son, David. And that's really awesome. She's living out and radically mothering. I want to hear about how one radically mothers. And in the Hispanic culture, that means that you're a really good shot with a chancla from across the room. I don't want to hear about that radically mothering. I have so much respect for Alexandria. I'm grateful that she's agreed to come back and join me. And we are honored to have you with us, to have a conversation about the work you're doing, have a conversation about the time we're in, and have a conversation about how we can have a clearer lens looking forward to being a better society as we learn more so that we can be better and do better. Alexandria V. Taylor, welcome to Cafecito con Colon, my extrovert therapy.
Thank you so much. I'm honored and extremely grateful to once again be in conversation with you, Brian. So thank you so much for this opportunity.
You bet. And you do make your ancestors proud. Tell us about that photograph that I used to promote this episode of Cafecito con Colon. Where is that? I know the quote, you know the quote, but where was that? And let's talk about it.
Yeah, I really appreciate you sharing that. That picture means a lot to me. That picture was taken at the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. And I had the great fortune of visiting there last summer. And I will just say it is something, and it is an experience that you feel from the soles of your feet all the way up your spine to the top of your head. It is a fully embodied experience. I'm the descendant of African people who were enslaved and brought to this country, and who were brought to what is now called the state of Louisiana. And so my direct bloodline is from the South, and being there in Montgomery, Alabama, that memorial is a memorial to victims of lynching during the Jim Crow South. And I stood under the parish that my grandparents are from in Louisiana, and realized how recent that history is from completely potentially eradicating our bloodline and my existence here today, right? Because it is still, as we have seen, unfortunately, a threat, but it was a very real threat to extinguishing our families during that time. And so being in that space, standing and paying honor to my ancestors who came from that very parish and who survived, and not only survived, but thrived, really, really, really was moving and life-changing for me. And so that picture is a reminder of everything I felt while I was there, and everything that continues to drive me in moving forward and thriving in this lifetime.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I think just hearing that helps us remember how recent this painful history was. I look at, so often we forget the timeline, whether it's my ancestry who we lost in the concentration camps, or whether it's your grandparents, and the lynchings that took place just those 2 generations ago. I mean, it's mind blowing. Mm-hmm. And it's easily forgotten how recent that history is.
Yeah.
So I want to give you a chance. We're at 9:22. I don't want to miss the opportunity to shine a spotlight on the good work you do today. And we're going to get to your story. But I also, I love your work, and I think it's so critical. And frankly, during the time of the COVID-19 pandemic, I think it's more important than ever because of what we have in terms of what I'll call a lockdown, or times of quarantining in our homes. We know that violence is up. We know that domestic violence is up. These are data points. This is not anecdotal. We know that your work is critical right now. So let's take a couple minutes out of today's episode where we're going to listen and learn about your journey and your lived experience. And let's talk about your current work for just a minute.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's really important because my current work addressing gender-based violence is directly connected to any racial justice work I do. And I think it's really important for us to always hold the lens and the analysis that when we're talking about racialized violence, we are also talking about gendered violence. And when we're talking about gendered violence, we are also talking about racialized violence. And I just always want to kind of keep that front and center. We have programs and partners all over the state in our rape crisis centers and our sexual assault coordinators and our sexual assault nurse examiners, and many other allies and co-conspirators on the periphery doing similar work that are really working hard to, as you said, make sure that when someone chooses and is courageous to ask for help, they are welcomed in an environment that is culturally sensitive to their needs and to understanding what it is that they need. And I think, you know, we have to keep thinking about how gendered violence and racial violence intersect. We do a lot of work under the Federal Prison Rape Elimination Act. We've been working with the New Mexico Corrections Department in being in compliance with that. And one of the things that we say when we're doing that work is that, you know, rape is not a part of the sentence. That too leads to rape culture. And so when we see things where, whether it's immigrant families who are being detained at the border or in our state, or us not allowing folks who are presently incarcerated to be released with the threat of COVID-19, all of that intersects because it all upholds those cultures that are rooted in oppressive systems and oppression around race, class, sex, gender. And so I think it's central to the work that I do at the coalition.
I think we all need to learn that word intersectionality, right? I mean, it's a word that we talked about in law school when we talked about, you know, lack crit theory and some of these other things that I learned about. But I really appreciate that word is coming to the forefront. And I think you stated it in a really beautiful, succinct, and clear way. So thank you for doing that. That's an important part of the conversation that doesn't always take place. So thanks for educating us. I appreciate that. And boy, you sure have some fans out here. Wow. I mean, like once in a lifetime kind of leader. My goodness.
Wow.
Wow, this is great. And very nice, very nice. And I'm glad our sound is better. I'm sorry that it was bad earlier. And I went to comment or like a comment and I might have deleted it. So if it was your comment, I apologize. I don't remember which one it was, but I think I accidentally deleted the comment. I never delete comments. Unintentional. Let's talk, I appreciate that. And if folks want to get more information about that work you're doing now, what's the best way for them to contact you?
Well, our website is www.nmcsap.org. And there's actually, we have contact forms for our staff on there, and I'll get those messages directly that way. And also, you know, social media is a super great way to connect as well.
I love it. And that's a perfect segue. I posted that link there, but that's a perfect segue because social media is a perfect way to connect with you. But if they try and find Alexandria V. Taylor, they're not going to be able to do it. You got to be looking for Nisi. Now, let's talk about Nisi. How your community knows you. Tell me about Nisi. What's that all about?
Yeah, Nisi is the name I've gone by next week on Tuesday, my birthday, 36 years. And so my middle name, that V, why it's so important to me, is my middle name, Venice, which I share with my paternal grandmother, Carnell Taylor, who is and has been and always will be the major driving influence in my life. When I talk about our roots in Louisiana, it is her and my grandfather that I speak of. And so I go by Nisi, it's what I've always gone by. And then in professional spaces, Alexandria started to stick. So that's where it's at.
Well, that's perfect. That's perfect. Thank you, Nisi. So if you want to connect with her on social media, it's Nisi Taylor. And I think that Catherine actually posted or tagged you in the comments section there. So folks, if you want to find her, I think Kathy McGill posted or tagged Nisi on there, so you can check that out. Let's talk a little bit about this next chapter. You find yourself in the center of what could be transformational. transformational, and I think you find yourself at the center because of that work that I talked about you doing before. You have done a phenomenal job of setting a table of stakeholders and change agents to assist and support community. And you've done that in your career in your short 36 years or 35 years and 51 weeks. You have been good at setting a table and of policy leaders and stakeholders. And I think that the governor recognized that and asked you to be front and center. And here is the story, really good coverage, because the LA Daily Post just really kind of puts up information, doesn't really add much commentary. They just really help tell a story by posting up the information that comes out from official agencies. And this is the story there, and it's got some great quotes in there. And I encourage you to take some time to read that piece. And the governor's office and state agencies are supposed to be listening to the conversation and the dialogue, because the governor created a council for racial justice on this quote: "My administration will ensure racial justice is central to our work. We will provide a platform and give those voices that need to be heard right now the opportunity to lead this dialogue about justice and structural reform in our state. We have generational work to do in restoring educational outcomes and opportunities for people of color and disadvantaged populations in our state. The system will not reform itself. The system will not reform itself, and indeed it will not. And so we need transformational leaders to step up and assist us with being able to listen. And when I say us, I mean public policy officials, elected officials, systemic leaders, to be able to listen to people who can help us have transformational change. And when the governor looked around and said, who can help us lead that discussion, she quickly identified Alexandria V. Taylor, Nisi. So tell us about this opportunity. Tell us about this Advisory Council for Racial Justice and what it's starting to look like. Because I don't think you were given a lot of constraints. You were given an opportunity. She put some folks at the front of the table and said, I want to invite more. These are some of the stakeholders we're going to have who will be represented. And I won't go through all those, but she did list several. Right now she wanted law enforcement officers from across the state, leaders and youth from the African American, Asian American, Hispanic, Native American communities, and set that out as a beginning part of the conversation of who should be at the table. But now you're getting to help lead who else needs to be invited. Now I want to listen. Tell us about this Council for Racial Justice.
Yeah, I would add to that the system will not transform itself, but it'll also actively work to maintain itself if we're not intentional about doing the work to transform it.
Because we're learning that the system, we say the system's broken, and so appropriately, part of this dialogue we've had over the last 6 weeks in particular has been the system's not broken. It's doing exactly what it was established to do. And it was established by people in power. It was established to marginalize communities. And it was established to keep the status quo and to increase the power of those who were in power. And so I just want to be super clear about that. Go ahead, Alexandria.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. And so, I can't and I won't speak for the governor's office. And I was extremely humbled to be invited to that table. I think as the part of the Racial Justice Council, the conversation has been about discussing what we can do to respond to the most distressing indicators of racial injustice in the state of New Mexico. And I'm also humble enough to know that I applied to be on the council, even though it's already out there. I submitted my application to be on the council, just like all of the other committed people in New Mexico who have applied to be on that council and who are really committed to doing this work, because it's going to take intentionality, commitment, bold leadership, and accountability. And so I want to shout out Amy Whitfield, who's with CYFD and who is now on special assignment to the governor's office, who has been also working on this. Who has really been working on this really intentionally and taking the load of that. We had the listening session. The governor had a listening session last Friday, And I think the participation in that listening session, the number of people who participated and the amount of questions that were coming in shows that this is something that we need to sustain. We need to build it. We need to build the infrastructure, and we need to sustain it, because as you have said this morning, and I've heard most of your guests say since you started this listening series, is that we need to listen, right? And for people's voices to be heard, we have to continue creating space for people to be heard, for them to have opportunities to speak their truth, and to have people who are intentionally leading. I loved the conversation you had with Pastor Bicknell. It's so important. In that conversation, I felt like I was sitting at the feet of an elder, because the movement must be multi-generational. And I think really important to this council is that we do have a multicultural, multi-generational representation to be looking at the needs across the state. Just this Saturday, I had the blessing to sit with Dr. Angela Davis virtually at a fundraiser that was hosted by an amazing organization here in our state, Crossroads for Women. And she was asked, like, how she continues on, how does she continue to remain in this struggle? And she said that she remains connected to young people doing the work because it's where she believes hope resides. And that just underscores, I mean, thinking about Dr. Bicknell and Angela Davis and how much movement we've had with the Movement for Black Lives, which is built on those who came before us through the civil rights movement and the abolition movement of slavery. And it must be multi-generational. And so I hope to see the council reflect that. I don't want to miss that on a lot of these conversations I have heard in New Mexico. So, you know, I heard Kathy say when she was on kicking off this series that, you know, she certainly can't represent all Black people. I certainly can't either. I can just share my experience. And I have heard in New Mexico, you know, since we've been talking about Black Lives Matter, that it is true in New Mexico, right? Native people, Hispanics are also disproportionately impacted by racial injustice in our state. And again, if we go back to Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, if we go back to Audre Lorde about intersectionality, what we're talking about is that when we center the liberation for Black lives in this moment, we are also centering the liberation of everyone in this moment, right? We can't deny that New Mexico is at the top of the list for missing and murdered Indigenous women. Again, that intersectional lens of gendered violence and racial violence. And so this work for Black Lives Matter is also tilling the soil for the liberation of all people, including our Indigenous relatives, including all Black and Brown people. And so, you know, Bell Hooks, a feminist, a Black feminist scholar, talks about a framework of moving margin to center. And I think what a lot of people think that means is that we take those on the margins and we try to bring them to center. I just was having this conversation when a corporation was asking me if I felt like a mentorship project for women of color would be a good idea, would be a good action for them to take. And I said, well, who's teaching that? Who's going to be facilitating that? Because are you suggesting that women of color don't embody leadership skills? Are you suggesting that women of color aren't good at writing resumes and interviewing to secure the job? Or are you saying that they don't assimilate to the white patriarchal framework that you would like for us to assimilate to fit into your culture? And Bell Hooks talks about, we're not trying to move to center in that way, but she talks about that center needs to move to the margin, that marginality is actually the site of resistance and resilience. It's actually the place where radical change happens. And so I challenge us when we talk about equity and inclusion and diversity, the reason why we need to talk about inclusion, and the reason why we need to talk about diversity is because we're still centering whiteness. And so once we can start recentering, that framework completely shifts. And so our liberation is directly bound up in the liberation of every person. It's a multiracial movement. It's centering Black, Indigenous, Brown unity. And I hope that the council reflects that in many ways. Pamela Herndon invited me to a roundtable discussion last year with women from South Africa who are also doing gender-based violence work. And one of the women from South Africa said, you know, nothing for us without us, to the point where they actually keep a register of who is at the meeting. Is this meeting going to impact young folks? Well, then how much representation of young people are actually here? And to the point where if decisions are going to be made about a group of people and there is no representation at the table, the meeting doesn't happen. That's moving the center to the margins. And I think we have to radically shift the way we approach all of this work. And I hope that we invest in the infrastructure, we invest in the sustainability, because it's not going to happen in 6 months before 2021 legislative session.
I think that's fantastic. And I love, you know, we must move those on the margins to the center. That is fantastic. You know, and I can think about over time when we've tried to do that, and it works. It works. I can tell you that it works. You know, in some ways, I think about 30 years ago when I was advocating for putting students on the Board of Regents for our higher learning institutions, particularly students of color on our Board of Regents in our institutions of higher education, and how much resistance we got. I mean, it was not an easy task to make that happen. And now we have it, and there's some great data points out there that show that, you know, people like Antonia Roybal-Mack and other great women of color and young men of color have led on these institutions, conversations that are so critical and important on everything from tuition raises to just having that seat at the table and having that perspective of those who will be impacted most by the decisions being made. Man, I love that. Moving from the margins to the center. That's just really fantastic.
Yeah, and we have a responsibility, Brian. So I'm a Black woman. I've spent my career in the nonprofit sector, and I have certainly in the social justice nonprofit sector, which suggests that there's some progressiveness to that sector. And I have certainly experienced racism directed towards me for showing up in spaces with the opinions that I have and being vocal about that, right? And so I think it's really important. You know, Shirley Chisholm said, if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring your folding chair. But I think it's really important for those of us in leadership positions to also do the internal work within organizations, within institutions, because someone can be at the table and their voice can still not be valued, and room can still not be created for them to be able to truthfully show up and share. And so I think one of the roles of leadership in all different sectors is to be doing the internal work before anyone makes a Black Lives Matter statement or before anyone declares that they're doing equity and inclusion work and mentorship. I think the onus is on those in leadership to start internally to make sure that those systems and those institutions are actually ready to listen and to absorb the voices that we're making room for at the table. And the reality of that is that we might have to have some hard conversations if some of those voices that have been gatekeeping need to push back from the table altogether.
I think that's powerful. And I think it leans into the statements you already made, which I actually posted here. But to your point, I think in those boardrooms, in those C-suites, in those leadership organizations or the leadership of those organizations, we have got to till the soil with that training before we plant those seeds of knowledge that they're supposed to be listening to. Because if we plant those seeds of knowledge on soil that hasn't been tilled, then to what end? And how effective is that really going to be? Or is it simply window dressing so I can feel better, right? Like, because we're not worried about, far too long, we've not been worried about what we need to do to make you feel better, what we can do to make sure that you are empowered. But instead, we've thought about ways to make ourselves feel better. And that's just planting those seeds on soil that hasn't been tilled. And I don't have to tell you, being born and raised in New Mexico, we got a long agricultural background and history, and you got to till the soil first. Isn't that right?
You have to till the soil. You have to till the soil. Love is a verb. You have to put it into action. I'm also so, a part of this too, and showing up in spaces are like the health effects of racism, right? And the tilling of the soil is so vital because racism, microaggressions, macroaggressions, overt, covert racism really, really affects us. Dr. Jules Harrell, a professor at Howard University, actually did some research on how racism affects mental and physical health of Black people. And his research showed the actual health outcomes racism has on Black people, including high blood pressure and how hard the heart beats when experiencing things such as racism, right? Our systems are hardwired for human connection. They're extremely sensitive to this. And so even being at the table at a place where someone is microaggressing towards you. I've had the comments where I've spoken up in meeting spaces and someone says, I'm always intimidated when you're in the room, just for advocating for the issues that I care about, right? That has an actual effect on my health, right? What we saw about what happened at the Loveless Hospital with their policy discriminating against Native women, right? Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, who's now the California Surgeon General, she says it's directly related to the history of racial oppression in our nation. So if we want to talk about the health outcomes of COVID-19 and the disproportionate rates they're infecting Black and impacting Black and Indigenous people of color, let's move upstream to why we have this structural racism that puts us more at risk for this disease, right? And it's rooted in oppression and racial oppression because it literally has an impact on our bodies and on our minds. And so in this talk too, I'm super committed to how we, one, allow Black, Indigenous, and Brown folks to rest, right? We're in the fight, but also we need to rest because our bodies and our spirits need that rest. But it's directly tied to the outcomes we see today. And I don't think we can hold any of that in a single lens.
No, that's well stated. For those of you that are not familiar with the upstream reference, I'll let you look up the full story, but really the analogy is you got a bunch of dead fish that are coming downstream and you're trying to analyze and figure out, you're looking at the fish and trying to figure out what killed these fish. And then somebody who was wise, it was probably a wise woman of color who said, you need to quit looking down here and you need to go upstream and figure out what's causing this. And so it's a powerful analogy. And I think I appreciate you bringing it to this discussion. I want to, be very judicious with your time. I know how busy you are. You've got your job that you do with the coalition. You've got the heavy lift that you're doing with the council and all the great things that you're doing to impact our community in a positive way before you rest. But I don't want to miss the opportunity for the last 10 or 15 minutes to actually ask you to help us listen to what the journey has been like for you personally, Alexandria V. Taylor, Nisi, of being someone who is part of that 3%, part of that universe of students who grew up in a system where they looked to the front of the classroom and they never or rarely saw a reflection of themselves. And what have you experienced? What has been your lived experience in New Mexico, a lifelong New Mexican, and help us better understand?
Yeah. So I was born and raised in Alamogordo, and when I reflect on that, I realize now just how loving my family and the community that we were a part of in Alamogordo really was. And I also recognize just how much my parents and my family probably shielded my sister and I from. And that's just the reality. You know, I love that there's a question that goes around asking, when was your first time having a Black teacher or a teacher of color? And I can say, you know, mine was third grade, Sacramento Elementary School, Mrs. Carr in Alamogordo, New Mexico. And she had taught my sister and my older cousins. She educated our entire generation of a family. And so that was pretty early on in my schooling that I benefited from that. But my son here in Albuquerque going into the 7th grade still has yet to have that experience. And he's aware of it. He recognizes it. He asks if we can move back to Baltimore, where he was born, right? Because he recognizes that something is different and he's not reflected back in his school or in many spaces here. And so I just come to this from that awareness of my experience growing up and also now raising a child here.
How old is David?
Again, David is 12.
Oh, sorry. If you mentioned that, I missed it. I apologize.
I did not. He's 12 and he's the love of my life. He doesn't like for me to talk about him a lot. So I respect that because we teach consent in our household.
Yeah, but that radical mothering, you know, that radical mothering.
That's a part of it.
You might have some exceptions to the rule, David.
That's a part of that radical mothering, is respecting and having mutual respect in our household. But you know, when I reflect on it, I realize we certainly did experience microaggressions, you know, coming from my parents provided for us and just people making comments about where we lived growing up and like, oh, I didn't know Black people lived there, you know, and things like that. At the time, I didn't know what they were, but now I can call them by their name. And so that was certainly my experience growing up. Like I mentioned, being in the nonprofit sector here in New Mexico has been an experience, and I have talked about at even our our statewide advocacy conference around some of the racism I have experienced as being a Black woman, then executive director in Valencia County. And how I could walk into meetings and people would make comments like, oh, watch out for her, she will threaten you, which is me literally being the fierce advocate that I am, especially when it comes to survivors of domestic violence, sexual violence, and child abuse. And so, you know, talking about that experience and also having to do the own reflection of what it means that, you know, you can have proximity to power, but these systems will seek to remind you that you don't actually hold the power. And I have experienced that in many ways. I've had to advocate for my son since kindergarten, being in the public school system. I've had friends who are non-Black parents who have Black kids, and they've asked me, how do you help navigate schooling in New Mexico? And I say, you have to remain persistent. If you have the ability to be at the school regularly, you have to do that, because I have seen since kindergarten how my son has been called in or brought to account when entire groups of kids were responsible. And I would always ask, did you call the other parents? And, you know, the standard response is, no, and we can't discuss other students with you further. And I'm like, I don't need to know the details. I need to know, did you also call the other parents? Because you are also calling me. And so you have to remain really persistent, right? The disproportionate rates of suspension and expulsions in APS, that data is clear that children of color are most impacted by that. And so remaining diligent about that. I wear my hair in locks in a natural hairstyle. And, you know, there is legislation traveling around our country right now to protect Black women to simply wear our hair the way it grows out of our head. And I am fortunate that I work at a place that is not one that discriminates against me or others in that way. But that's a real experience that I think about when I enter into spaces of how I choose to show up and present myself.
You know, and I appreciate that so much. And Alamogordo, it feels like when I spent time in Alamogordo, because I had a business in Las Cruces and also served Alamogordo, because I think of the base, there was a higher representation of Black people in Alamogordo than there was Las Cruces. It felt that way anyway to me from the outside looking in. But when I think about where I grew up, Los Lunas and Valencia County, I mean, that's a community. I mean, I went to a socially distanced protest where I spoke in Valencia County, and you know, their interaction with Black people is severely limited. And so I think about you walking into those rooms, and when I think about all the organizations that helped make sure I didn't fall through the cracks, I can't think of a single one that had leadership that was Black. I mean, I'm talking about Rotary International, Sir Optimist, all the business association, Valencia County business, the Bosque Farms Business Association. There was no representation there because the community is so small. So I have to, I think, number one, applaud you for being powerful and confident enough to be a consistent and persistent advocate in a community that, frankly, that soil I don't think had been tilled much. I mean, I grew up at the flea market, and when I reflect on that time, we had Mr. Joy, Lawrence Joy. I wonder where Lawrence Joy is. Oh my goodness. I hadn't thought of that name in a long time. But he used to sell tires at the flea market. And he was one of my favorite vendors. He was so good to me. Oh my goodness. He was so good to me. I was just a little kid. But when I think about our vendors and our consistent customers, like he's the Black man that comes to mind, like not of all those guys, like he was the guy. And he always either had like a little treat for me or kind words for me. And I looked at him as being one of the hardest working men I knew. He was like my father in terms of his work ethic. He was one of the first there to unload those heavy tires and one of the last to leave. And if somebody out there in the internet world knows the Joy family, and Lawrence used to sell at I believe it was Lawrence was his first name. I just knew him as Mr. Joy, but I might be conflating a Lawrence Joy from Las Cruces with Mr. Joy from the flea market. But if anybody knows Mr. Joy who used to sell at the flea market, what a beautiful man. And I'd love to hear from you.
That'd be awesome.
Sorry to take up the time with that, Alexandria, but
please do. I love to hear about Mr. Joy.
Oh, he is great. He is great. He set up on the front row on the end. We gave him a little extra space, and I don't think we charged him for that. It was just $5 for the table. Help us better understand as we wrap up a little bit. Thank you for speaking specifically about your advocacy for your son, David. Is there anything else you want to share about your lived experience to help us understand what it was to grow up and now be a professional in New Mexico and being part of that 3%, that very valued 3% that has not been treated as a valued 3% or more? And then maybe close with your guidance for us on how to be better allies and how to be better listeners, and where do we go from here? Somebody had a great question, which was, how do we keep the engine going? Like, we've started the engine, and I've said it slightly differently, which is, I don't want this to be a flashpoint. I want this to be a true tipping point in New Mexico for New Mexico. But what are your thoughts on that? And I'm going to let you close us out.
Yeah, and I want to honor your time and also everyone who tunes into this and their time as well. But thank you for this question, because I think it's really important. I've heard other activists say that this is not just a moment, this is a movement, and movement takes continued, consistent movement, right? And so we should all commit to not allowing this to just be a moment in time where we've spent 5 weeks or 2 months talking about this and then we go back to doing whatever we were doing before, but let's keep the movement going. I think, Valencia County was extremely welcoming to me and extremely supportive of our work down there. And we built those services up that had been there for 20 years. We built them up in a way that I am just super proud of. Part of my role there, as I mentioned in my bio, was coordinating law enforcement agencies in a multidisciplinary response around child abuse cases, around domestic violence and sexual assault cases. And I want to, I believe in listening to the demands of the people most impacted right now. I believe in listening to what the people on the street are saying right now, what movement leaders are saying right now. And this comes up because I work in the sexual violence field. We have centered a criminal justice response to that for so long. And I want to root it in this. There's a licensed clinical social worker who's a Black man, Resma Minikin, and he in his book is called My Grandmother's Hands, and he talks about culture, bodies of culture. And one of the bodies of culture he talks about are police bodies. And what I can say as a Black woman doing that work in a multidisciplinary fashion, showing up to roll call at 6 a.m. to provide officer training is that I have seen how those bodies of culture do not allow for people to show up as themselves. I have been in relationship and worked day in and day out on some of the worst violence in our communities with law enforcement officers and sat at lunch tables and they've looked at me and said, but I will never say Black Lives Matter. Those bodies of culture take away from our humanity and our ability to connect and deepen relationship person to person. And that's how this work is sustained, to start deepening relationship person to person and to start allowing those bodies of culture to shed that hold us to beliefs and values that we truly may not embody. But because of our space and place, we uphold those systems.
I love that. I posted a link to, I think Armando was asking, but I posted the link, My Grandmother's Hands. I think that was the social worker you're referencing, right, Alexandria?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So Armando, that's on there. That's that link I used. Barnes & Noble this time. Try and buy local. Usually the first one that pops up is usually Amazon. This time I skipped Amazon and got to Barnes & Noble. So there's still big dogs, but try and buy local. We've got a couple of good bookstores here in town. Let's make sure we support them. Alexandria, thank you. I appreciate that. We have to start deepening relationships so that the bodies of culture can be shed, because those bodies of culture embrace a lot of hate, and they are heavy. And the history, whether we know it personally, it is passed intergenerationally, even if it's just subconscious. And we talk about that latent bias or that unconscious bias. That's where it comes from. It's where it comes from. We've all, whether we believe we have racism in our families, whatever is in our families, and if it's microaggressions, so that it's not seeming racist, we embrace what we've been surrounded by. And so we do have to shed that. And we can only shed that by listening to strong people like Alexandria, who can give us insights into their journey so that we can be better allies. I'm trying to listen more. I am trying to know better so that I can do better and be better. And you helped me do that, Alexandria. Thank you so much. I appreciate you and highly value the work you do. And I highly value the space that you occupy. I thank you for your leadership at the city level. I got a text message from our CAO for the city of Albuquerque. Yeah. What is Sarita? CAO, right?
Yeah, I think
Am I
so.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you. And I'm very honored to know, and I didn't know this until this morning, that she tunes in on occasion and she watches
Oh,
replays.
cool.
And I am now more nervous than I was before knowing that, because I hold Sarita in such high regard. But it's been a real privilege to be able to create this platform for folks like you to educate us. So thank you for educating me. Thank you for doing what you do. Thank you for your work on the Governor's Council on racial justice. And thanks for your work in that space of taking victims to the place of survivorship, to the ultimate place of thriving in New Mexico. They deserve that. And I will support you, and you call me anytime. And the answer will be yes, and I want to do more. So thank you, Alexandria V. Taylor, Nisi, for
Thank
being
you,
on
Brian.
Cafecito. Make it a beautiful day. And folks,
Thank
remember, reach
you.
out to individuals. You're very, very welcome. And I encourage all our Cafecito viewers to reach out to folks who are in isolation and remind them that they're not alone. Make sure that you embrace best practices, wear your mask. UNM Bookstore has rolled out a line of masks. I went and bought a few yesterday. They've got some great ones with our I don't have it in front of me to reach, but make sure you wear your mask, practice social distancing on this beautiful weekend of celebration of our independence. Let us reflect upon how we can be a more perfect union and how we can be better now that we know better. Make sure that you don't attend big gatherings. Know that tomorrow Marjorie will be on. She is going to provide a perspective we haven't had before. She's an incredible mother and leader and a really beautiful, strong voice who has enriched my world. And I'm so glad she's agreed to come on. And then on Independence Day, we will have Mr. Incredible. He reminds me of Ralph down there in Valencia County. He is, you know, Ralph, right? Yeah.
Yes,
Ralph
I
is
do know Ralph.
right. He's doing a good job with economic development down there in Valencia County, but somebody who is really taking a deep dive into a community that he's loved for so long and grew up in, I believe. But in the international district, he said, we need a voice and a place and a space to go from surviving in that area to thriving as it relates to economic development. His name is Alex Horton. And I can't wait to have little Alex on our show tomorrow. Alex is just a dynamic human being. And I can't wait to have him speak to us on Independence Day, Saturday. And then next week, we got another great set of folks coming on. It is going to be Khalil is going to come on. He facilitated that great conversation with Alexandria and the council for the governor's listening opportunity last week. And I reached out to him. He immediately responded. I said, I got to have you on, man. You're going to take me to the mat, and I can't wait to get down there to make sure that I'm tilling the soil and giving everybody an opportunity to plant the right seeds. Thank you for planting seeds today, Alexandria. Make it a beautiful day. Happy Independence Day weekend, and be blessed. And reach out to those folks who are isolated. Tell them they're not alone. God bless you, Alexandria. Bye-bye.